Okay.
So my students do.
We are in week 9 of membership, and this is the week we talk about particulars. How many of you guys have heard the saying, the devil is in the detail? What does that mean?
Do you want to read it?
No, sometimes, listen, sometimes it means that, the really important stuff is buried in the particulars. But there's another meaning for it. Sometimes people get way too caught up in details and they fight over stuff that's actually not very central. And the devil's in the details because that's what everybody argues over. What we're talking about today is the place where most churches, when they do membership, starts with. They talk about denominations, they talk about church structures, they talk about finances, they talk about theological camps, they talk about their positions on hot button issues. Those things are all valid and important, and there is a place for them. But there are a lot of details, and it is really easy, what's the saying, to miss the forest for all the trees. So what I want to do today is we're going to talk about the details, but I'm going to try to do it in a way that helps us not to get bogged down or lost. So here's our talking points. Number 1, I want to remind you where we've come from, what's most central to us. Number 2, I'm going to tell you about the family. And man, it is full of characters. Number 3, I want to try to locate our church in context. Number 4, I'm going to try to answer some common questions about particulars. Number 5, I'm going to remind you what matters most. And you're like, that sounds like the first thing. Yes. I'm going to kind of do the first point all over again and say, remember to keep Jesus most central. So those are the 5 things. Where do we come from? What's really central to us? What's the family, the characters in it? Number 3, what's the context that our church fits into the family? Number 4, some common questions, just particulars. Number 5, let's remember what matters most. Relax. None of this is on the test, okay, except maybe the part about Jesus. So basically, this is a week we're not in Scripture. There's not a passage on this, although I'm going to bring it back to a passage at the tail end. But I think this is important stuff, and we've got to do it. Membership's the place that we do it. So let's start by remembering. If you look at the handout that I gave you, this is from the very first week, and I just want to revisit it. Over the past 8 weeks, really it's 10 weeks, but 8 sessions, we've talked about friendship, Jesus, sin, shalom, grace. All of those things are very, very central to who we are as a church. Now, we've also talked about some of our distinctives, things that make us not better, but unique. Okay, specifically this commitment to being bivocational, small house church, seeking the shalom of the city. Now we're finally getting in week 9 down to particulars. And I just want to remind you, do you remember what I said about the difference between a value and a strategy? You'll hear me say this multiple times. Here's the summary. A strategy is something you do when it makes sense. You come up with a plan, you work the plan. If it works, you keep doing it. If it doesn't work, you pivot. That's a strategy, strategic. You do it when it works. A value is something you do even when it doesn't. Honesty, truth, integrity. Those are value things. They need to be. Okay, now listen, here's my point. All of the stuff at the top, friendship, Jesus, sin, shalom, grace, those are value things for us. Please, keep those at the center. Everything we talk about today is, some of it's going to be strategic at best. That doesn't mean it's not important. I think all of these things are going to influence us as a church. But some of them are just like even incidental. Like, why are we in the EPC? Do you know what the reason is? My previous denomination didn't want me. And the EPC was like, we'll take you.
What were you?
Okay, so PCA. My point here is keep in mind, we're at a place where a lot of these details that I'm sharing are very peripheral. They're not central to our identity as a church. And you don't have to agree on these things in order to be a member. Okay? So, that's the first thing. Remember where we came from. Second thing, let me tell you about the family, characters. There's 2 sheets. Okay, see this sheet, the big sheet?
It's in color.
Okay, I spent probably 4 or 5 hours working on this big sheet.
Did you make this?
No, I didn't. I copied it. Okay. Because with the love of Jesus, Ashley. Okay.
That's a really valid question.
Because the version that you can download off the web, you can't read it.
Yeah.
It's so fine-grained. And I didn't have time to actually, they sell a hard copy that's 3 feet by 4 feet or whatever. But the problem is there's too much detail. This thing is basically a 30,000 foot overview of the past 2,000 years. And what we actually need...
So this is where you spent 4 to 5 hours.
No, this I spent 8 hours on. Okay, sorry. It's a lot of time, yeah.
We didn't have that.
So,
Were you building it from scratch?
yeah, this is built...
Okay, that
Listen,
makes sense. Okay, that makes
this...
sense. Okay.
Which one are we on this one?
I want you to watch look at this, the one that you can read. Yeah. Think of this as a 120,000 foot view. I am going to cover 2,000 years of church history in 10 minutes. Are you ready?
I love it.
Okay.
All right, let's put it on the timer. Let's put it on the
2 minutes of
Okay. If you don't make any comments, I can do this. You ready? Here we go. All right. Okay, if you look at this chart right here, Christianity starts with Judaism. There's 4 basic camps in Judaism. You have the Pharisees, you have the Essenes, you have the Zealots, you have the Sadducees. There's more groups than this. Okay, but this is simple. I'm painting really broad brushstrokes. People from all of these groups became Christians. Okay? So the early church, we're talking 30 AD, 40 AD, into the early 50 AD, you mostly have Jewish converts, okay? And you're starting to get a very Jewish Christianity until you get to the middle of Acts, and Paul meets Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he says, I'm sending you to the world. And so what starts to happen is you have an influx of what this big chart calls Pauline Christianity. But really, it's the tension of you've got people coming from all over the known world, the Roman Empire, the nations, and they're becoming Christians. And you also have a Jewish stream becoming Christians, but the majority are non-Jews. And that's starting to form early Christianity. And by the time you get to about 100 AD, the apostles have all died, but their leaders and the people they've trained, you really have what's called apostolic Christianity, where they're like, hey, we listened to what Peter wrote, we listened to what Paul said. We're starting to have the letters, and they're exchanging them among churches. And all of that is going to become, by about 300, this thing that's very soft and fuzzy called Nicene Christianity. And what that means is, in right around 300, Christianity becomes legal. By that time, Christianity is the majority faith in the entire Roman Empire. It has taken over the world. They get legalized. And all of a sudden you have these underground churches that have spent basically 300 years trying to do their thing in secret. And now they all come out and they're like, holy cow, there's a lot of Christians. We've got to figure out how to work together. And they started organizing councils. And so the very first major council was the Council of Nicaea, 325. That kind of forms they're like, hey, here's what it means to be Christian. Here's the basic beliefs. Here's some certain things. You can go read all about it. It's really interesting, actually. But the point is, this is like the early apostolic Nicene Creed, okay, which comes out of Christianity. Now, what emerges over the next, let's call it 600-700 years, is the thing that really becomes known more and more as Roman Catholicism, okay? And that's the first thing. I drew it as a square, a solid, yet the Roman Catholic Church still exists today. You could think of it like a denomination, okay? It's bigger than a denomination. What happened is the Roman Empire, as Christianity took over, started to view itself as the Holy Roman Empire. Have you heard that word? In other words, because the church was really starting to run and to control the Roman Empire. I'm not saying that's a good thing, I'm just saying it happened. What happens, the first great split happens in 1054. It's called the Great Schism. That's when Eastern Orthodoxy breaks off. You'll see that little box, it's got round corners and a white center. That means Eastern Orthodoxy is not a single denomination. It actually includes whole denominations like the Russian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church. There's probably a whole bunch of other Orthodox churches, which you can see on this chart if you look at all the orange things up at the top. Okay. The next major split was in the Protestant Reformation, 1517 through 1648. Martin Luther. Okay, and what happens is, you guys tracking with me so far? Yes. This is good, right? Okay, you have three major camps. We're already down to like 1,500. Okay, we've covered 1,500 years already. You have three major camps that come out. Lutherans in Germany, and kind of the Germanic region. Anglicans were in England. Reformed was Scotland, and it was the European continent. You have it in Switzerland, you have it in Deutschland, okay, and you have some basically Dutch Reform. So you have a whole bunch, all of those are big traditions. Okay, Anglicans would be the Church of England. That's the actual denomination that developed. Now, if you look down, I drew a line from Europe to America. I'm not even following what's going on over in Europe. But down below this, you have three denominations that are still active and present, right? Three strains. Okay, you've got a Lutheran strain, an Anglican strain, and a Reformed strain. Those are still present today. So in the Lutherans, you have Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, ELCA. You have Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod. Both of these are active, okay, right now. There's something I want to say about these major strains. What you find is that they usually have a, where did I write it down? They have a range and a flavor. Here's what I mean by that. These are the two major Lutheran denominations. Okay, the ELCA, which is the main line, okay, and the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is kind of a protest movement. But the point is, if you go to any Lutheran church, all Lutheran churches are going to have kind of a distinctive Lutheran flavor. If you go to any Anglican, so in America, Episcopalians and Anglicans, they're going to feel pretty similar. If you go to Presbyterians, you're going to feel some similarity there. So you have kind of different flavors based on the region that they developed in. Okay, but within that, you find a range, and usually the range looks like this. There is a big kind of what's called the mainline denomination that has a lot of churches and a lot of people, but it tends to be pretty broad-based. And it usually tends to be more diluted, meaning it'll be more liberal on a lot of issues. And then you have smaller churches, which are usually the protest churches, where they're like, no, we ought to be doing this, okay? And so what happens is they actually splinter off, and they're like, we really care about truth, or we really care about this, or we really care about that. And that's why I call them protest movements. So you're going to find that in every major branch. So here, the Lutherans, you've got the main line, and you've got the Missouri Synod. In America, this is a really broad brushstroke, but I'm going to make it. You typically have the Episcopalians. They're going to be more like the English Anglicans. And then you have the Anglicans in America, which tend to be slightly more conservative, protesty. I'm not using the word protest in a bad sense. Okay, in Presbyterians, Reformed, which is what we are. Okay, you have the mainline church called the PCUSA. The next largest is the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America. That tends to be more conservative. The mainline tends to be more liberal. Okay, what happened after this? I'm gonna do this. There were three kind of revival movements. First Great Awakening was in 1730s, 1740. You had preachers like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. It happened both in England and in America. And what you saw is kind of a revitalization. Two new groups form. You have the Baptists, and guess what the largest denomination of Baptists here in America? Southern Baptist Convention. Okay? And then you also have the Methodists, the largest group of Methodists, United Methodist Church. Okay? Now, there's a second Great Awakening in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and what you get are some very different groups coming out of this. Key preacher for this time would have been a guy named Charles Finney. Very focused on emotional, like we're trying to connect with people emotionally and stir their emotion. We're going to make them feel guilty. We're going to make them feel like we're going to move people through their emotions. Okay? And what
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
what you actually see in the second, again, these are very broad brushstrokes, but you see additional groups that don't look, they're like look differently Christian. The Mormons, okay, Plymouth Brethren. There's a whole bunch of others. The third Great Awakening would be the late 1800s, early 1900s, and you actually have some distinct movements that largely broke off from the Methodists and some of the Baptists. Actually, there's one thing I want to point out. Do you see in the second Great Awakening the little arrows over on the right-hand side? See how they're different colors? What do you think that means?
They're all coming.
Yeah, they're actually, so the second Great Awakening is actually pulling people from all of these versions up above. And they're moving into new things that are like new denominations. In the third Great Awakening, that trend kind of continues. In other words, you're getting people coming out of these existing groups, forming new groups. You get things like the Wesleyan Church, the Free Methodist Church, Nazarene Church, Assemblies of God, Foursquare, Calvary Chapel, Vineyard. Okay, there's a whole bunch more, which you can see on the big thing if you drill into it. What I want to say is this, kind of the final movement, if you want to call it that, non-denominational churches. Do you know when they started? Really in the 1900s, 20th century. And what you're actually seeing now, maybe it's the great splintering. Okay, real quickly, did you follow kind of all this? Pretty good.
That was great.
Okay, listen, let me tell you, just to give you an idea, how many churches are in these different denominations. So if you look at the Roman Catholic Church in America, it's about 20,000 congregations. Okay? A lot. The Protestant, take that as a whole, in America, it is about 330,000 congregations. See that? I mean, that's like 10 times bigger, 10 times more Protestants. Okay. Now, if you drill into, let's take the Lutherans. The mainline Lutheran, ELCA, it's about 8,500 congregations. The Missouri Synod is about 6,000. So not quite evenly split, but a pretty significant kind of protest movement. Purity movement, whatever you want to call it. If you look over at the Presbyterians, the PCUSA, mainline, it's about 8,500 congregations. Okay? The PCA, the second largest Presbyterian denomination, it's only 1,900 churches. Where's the EPC in this? EPC doesn't even make the list. We're about 600. We're the third largest with 600. Okay, and then you got the OPC with 300, and then you've got like the whatever piece. Like there are these little Presbyterians with like, yeah, handfuls. Okay. Southern Baptist Convention, 46,000 congregations. Okay? The only thing, do you know what's actually surpassed the Southern Baptists? Non-denominational. Really, in the last few years, there's more. In other words, the non-denomination denomination.
Yeah, that's not weird.
And what that means is you have no idea where in other words, they could be all over the map. So it's basically, so that's kind of the layout. Now listen, here's the point I hope you take away from this. Presbyterians are small. Now what's interesting is if you go to the website, it's every single every denomination does this. But we all sound like this is where God is moving in the world, and He's doing great things and amazing things, and we're going to reach everybody for Jesus. And listen, we are trying. But the reality is Presbyterians are small. Okay? And our particular denomination, 600 churches, really small. And so I just want to help you be right-sized where you don't get, I don't want to puff it up and be like, this is a great thing, guys. It's like, guess what? We're tiny. We're like a tiny little fish in a tiny little corner of a very big pond. All right? And it's really important for us to remember, where is God working on this chart? Everywhere. He was working in the Roman Empire. He was working in the Holy Roman Empire. He's working in the Orthodox churches. He's working in the Roman Catholics. He is working in the Baptists. He's working in the Presbyterian. It's like, hey guys, we need to all remember we serve a big God who is working in all of these places. That doesn't mean they're all equally good or equally bad. All right? That's our context. Number 3, that's your family. Where do we fit in? All souls. I'm getting through this. Yeah, okay.
No one was stressed that you wouldn't.
Oh, I'm stressed because I know how much content there is, and I'm trying to we are a part of the EPC denomination. You know what EP stands for? The Easy Presbyterian Church. No. Technically, it's the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. But inside, I think it's, if we're gonna poke fun of people, I think it's good to poke fun of our own tribe instead of other people's tribe. So the internal joke is PCA, pipes, cigars, alcohol, or the perfect church in America. And then there's the OPC, which is the only perfect church. And then there's the EPC, which is either the extra Presbyterian church or the easy however you want to say it. Let me try to locate the EPC for you. We are actually in between the mainline church and the PCA. The PCA is a pretty conservative church in the sense that it doesn't ordain women. The mainline church requires that you ordain women. Okay? The EPC actually says, we think that individual churches should be able to make up a lot of their own minds on. In other words, we don't think we have to split over this issue. So in the EPC, you will find a mixture. There's 3 distinctives of the EPC. Number 1, they're actually open to spiritual gifts like tongues. I don't know of, the EPC. I don't know of any EPC where they actively speak in tongues, but they're open to it. It's part of their doctrinal statement. Second thing, they're open to women's ordination, but here's how it works. In terms of elders within a church, they leave that. Is it going to be male elders? Is it going to be female elder? Mixture? That's up to the individual church. In terms of teaching elders, pastors, that goes by presbytery. All right? And they're like, just in case you're in a presbytery where a pastor believes that hey, we should be able to ordain women, they're like, we have a special presbytery for you where it's the Mountain West. Anyway, that presbytery allows people that reside outside of it to be a part of it. So they've basically made provisions. There's a presbytery that anybody that actually is in favor of women's ordination. They can be a part of that presbytery, but that's the only reason that you can be like a remote presbytery. Otherwise, you need to be the presbytery that you're part of. Okay.
It's a regional thing.
Yeah, it's a regional thing. So Presbyterian means fundamentally elder-led. So where the word presbyteros, elder, is in the Greek. Let me say one other thing. The motto of the EPC, which I actually like, is in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, in all things, charity. And listen, the EPC, people are like, do you like the EPC? I'm like, I love the EPC. The EPC sucks at everything. We are not good. In other words, I'm not in the EPC because I thought the EPC was like the greatest thing since sliced bread. The EPC does not do, we do so many things poorly. We're small. We're not super efficient. We're not well organized. But here's what I like about the EPC. Because they're small, there's a lot less pride. And I increasingly think that is a really important thing in a because denominations tend to make us proud. Okay? So the EPC, because we kind of suck at everything, here's what's great about the EPC. When we came into it, my previous denomination was like, we know how to church plant, this house church, bivocational, not it. The EPC was like, we don't have a clue how to plant churches. Come on in. And they've been very willing and gracious to allow us to explore. So the EPC, I think, is a very good place to do R&D. Okay? We are comprised of 14 presbyteries. Presbyteries are geographic regions. Other denominations may call them synods, or maybe you've heard the term parishes. Parishes are usually a little bit small. So presbyteries tend to be large. So our presbytery, Gulf South Presbytery, covers part of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and a little corner of Alabama. That is a big chunk. We have 3 meetings a year. I make it to one of them. If it's in Texas, I go. But otherwise, it's just like, it's a 2-day thing. It's hard to get there. Once a year, it's what's called General Assembly. All the people from all the presbyteries come together. That actually feels more like a convention. All right? If anybody wants to go, more power to you. I went one time and I'm like, man, I'd rather hang out with you guys. So I'm not saying it's unimportant, but just that's kind of the denomination. The presbytery meetings feel a little bit like a legislative session. Meaning there's committees, they have meetings, they do credentialing, they address conflict, they try to establish policies, but really they're just coordinating churches. So our presbytery, you ready for you want to hear the exciting, what does our resume look like?
We have beer.
Yeah, we've got beer. We're the presbytery where wait, is that the place where there's the pastor that's got a brewery? And our presbytery, they're like, yeah! Okay. So,
My sister's boyfriend was like, you guys are doing Christmas at a brewery?
Yes.
I'm like, yeah, that's our
it's
pastor.
great.
It's like, this is weird, but also okay.
So,
Yeah.
our presbytery has 50 churches in it. 12 of those are currently without a pastor. That's a quarter, 25%. Listen, it gets worse. 35% of the churches in our presbytery, 35% have less than 35 people. That means we, a church of 35 to 40, are actually bigger than 40% of the churches in our presbytery. Okay? Now, it gets worse. We are one of the oldest denominations in the country. And by that, I don't mean we've been around the longest. I mean our average age, 62% are over 55. So when we go to presbytery, guys, I'm 55. Marilyn and I go to presbytery, and we're like the young people in the room. So, just like full transparency, when I look at our denomination, I go, the next 20 years are going to be really challenging. But the flip side is this seems to be where God's planted us. And we have an opportunity. Like right now, if you said, how many churches in our denomination are doing like the house church? Bivocational, there's a handful. House church is like 4 or 5. Okay? Rick in Phoenix, Thomas in Salt Lake City, us, and there's a couple others that are kind of doing various things. But we have an opportunity to have some influence, and these guys are willing to let us do R&D. So,
can you repeat that one more time, Christian? So not just out of the 50 in the Presbytery, you're saying 3 to 4 out of the entire denomination.
Are doing, yeah. So like the house church thing, most Presbyterians are like, what the heck is that? You take house church.
Rick and Thomas aren't in our Presbytery.
No, they're in a different, they're in the neighboring Presbytery. Okay, so why are we here? And I'm just going to give you a couple of reasons. Theologically, I actually fit. So when you hear me say, some Presbyterians will hear everything I just say and think, that guy hates Presbyterians. I'm like, no, I don't. I actually like being a Presbyterian. But I'm trying to be very realistic, and I don't want to get my identity from I want to get my identity from Jesus. But when I look and go, if I'm going to affiliate with anybody, this is a pretty good place. Now, I also fit fairly well theologically in the PCA. Okay? Practically, the EPC, I love being in the EPC because they're not pushing us to try to get big and become a typical EPC church. Okay? It's a great place to do R&D. They're not controlling. But long term, there's going to be challenges. And this is part of the reason why we're actively trying to build connections with other house church planners. But listen, we are willing to be friendly with all sorts of people. And I am willing to help people even in other denominations. Okay. So, the point, let me say this. This is the last thing I want to say about this. If you are in a denomination, love it as much as you can, but don't put your hope in it. But if you are not in a denomination, maybe you're one of those non-denomination, don't put your hope in that either. Every church has problems. Every church has struggles. We just have different problems. And so the goal is really to know, where has God placed me? Where is God calling me? What are our particular struggles? Okay. So with that, I'm going to jump. So we've talked about where do we come from? Keep things central. 2, the family. 2,000 years of church history in probably 14 minutes. We've located the church in the context of our denomination. Let me just tackle some common questions. I can do this in about 10 minutes. How do you become a church? Well, you need some people and you need a pastor. But the stages of becoming, when I came here to Texas, okay, I reached out to the EPC and they're like, hey, so the presbytery actually called me. They gave me an official calling to try to start a church here in Austin. And so what happened is I had a call. I'm a pastor, I'm an evangelist. That's what it's called. I started gathering a group of people. That becomes a mission group. Once you have a pastor and a handful of people, you can petition to actually be recognized as a mission church. And eventually, you become a grown-up church, which is called a particular church. What that usually means is that you're financially self-sustaining and you have elders. We've been financially self-sustaining for 4 or 5 years. I'm the only elder. You have to have multiple elders. Okay?
The EPC support you when you're a missional church?
The EPC probably gave us a total of $10,000 to $20,000. Most of our support came from friends and family, and then we just worked. So, okay. So, the process for becoming a church, you have to get to where you've got elders. We're not there yet. So we're technically what's called a mission church, which is ironic that we're a mission church that's larger than 40% of the regular churches. Okay, what does it take to be an elder? There are two, and this is true of all Presbyterian flavors. broad brushstroke. Okay, you have two kinds of elders. You have a teaching elder. That's usually what a pastor is. In order to be a teaching elder, you have to go spend 3 to 4 years at a seminary, have a master's level degree. You have to be examined at presbytery. You take, Marilyn, how many? I don't know where she went. I think when I was first examined, I had 18 to 20 hours of written exams.
Say that again?
He said it.
I can't hear what she said.
He
Anyway,
said it, 18 hours written exam.
I had 18 hours of written exams, probably 3 hours of committee exams. Then you get examined on the floor by all the people. Anybody who wants to do that's great. You're going to hate it. Marilyn did not think it was great. But that's what it takes to be a pastor.
Wait, does Marilyn have?
No.
Okay. Because she
No.
said she hated it, so she hated it.
She hated.
Okay.
To be a ruling elder, that just means non-seminary pastors in the church, or not non-seminary elders. So, in other words, that would be somebody that's a senior leader in the church. They actually participate in the decision, like the official decision-making process. Okay? The group of elders, when you have it, is called a session. It's like a board. Okay? Ruling elders are nominated by the congregation. So the congregation looks around and says, who do we think could be a leader? They're trained and examined by the church. And usually that training is 1 to 2 years. Okay? And then they are approved, if they pass like the examination, they're approved and received either by the session, or when you don't have a session yet, the first examination and approval will come from presbytery. Okay? All that to say, we still don't have elders. We're still a little ways away, probably a couple of years away from that. What does it take to be a deacon? That part is actually up to the churches. Okay? A deacon is somebody, like some Presbyterian churches, you don't technically have to have deacons. But historically and practically, what deacons are, it's you start to find people that are really good at mercy and benevolence. And it's like as you start to empower those people, okay? So this is something I definitely see us having this at a certain point, but right now we are just trying to give lots of people, anybody who wants to, have the opportunity. But if we continue to grow, as we grow and things get more complicated, we're going to have to find people that are really gifted at that. Okay. What does it take to be a leader? This is up to the individual churches. There's not an official position called leader. All right? For instance, we have treasurers. A church, anybody could be a treasurer. A church doesn't even have to have a treasurer. Okay? But generally, if you're going to have a bank account, somebody needs to be a treasurer. And you get to a certain size. Like early on, I was the treasurer. And within a couple of years, I'm like, guys, I can't handle all this. Somebody else needs to take it. So Garrett and Laura are doing a great job of that. But it could be a deacon, it could be an elder, it could be an individual. Here at All Souls, let's talk about elders for just a second. Particularly, what kind of leaders do elders need to be? Like I said before, it probably takes at least a year of training in addition to theological alignment. So if you're going to be an elder, the denomination is going to say, hey, you have to be on board with like the fact that we're a Calvinist denomination. To be a member, you don't have to be on board with that. To be a leader in the church, you don't have to be on board with that. But to be an elder in the church, you do. So there's a statement of faith, there's some creedal confessions. You're going to have, like the presbytery is going to want to make sure that somebody checks the right boxes theologically. Okay? But from a local perspective, we want to make sure that not only you check the right boxes theologically, but that you really embody the values and the qualities that we are trying to cultivate. So here's what this means. What we say over and over and over again, our number one job as a church is to help you read and pray and learn to hear God's voice and respond in faith. That means anybody that's going to be a leader at All Souls that's got to be going on in their life. Okay? In addition to that, We are looking for people whose lives are being shaped and transformed by the gospel, not just by their theology, but they're being moved to walk in faith. We're looking for people with honesty, okay? We're looking for people that actively serve. They give, they share, they participate, they volunteer. We're looking for people that exert leadership. Like, in other words, simply picking somebody and going, you're a leader, I actually don't think that makes people follow. I think leaders do things that people start to recognize and they start to listen to. And when somebody who is a leader like explains something, people kind of follow. And so we're looking for somebody that can actually exert leadership, okay, and help move our church in a particular direction. All right? So that means they've got to share the vision and the values, particularly when you go back to what we talked about in membership, those core value things need to be really central to them. And the sense of calling, bivocational, small house, okay, mercy and benevolence. If we had somebody who might be really, really gifted and talented, maybe they could be an elder in another church, but let's say they came here and they were like, man, my vision for church is to be a big church. We wouldn't want that person to actually be an elder unless we'd want to change our direction. Does that make sense? Okay, and that's not saying our direction is right, their direction is wrong. We're trying to pursue what we feel called to. Okay, one of the things we say at Lazarus about leaders, core values, always learning, always teaching, always owning. Meaning they're constant, they're just learners. Somebody who's going to be a good leader needs to be constantly learning. And then constantly going, hey, you know what I'm learning? And they actually start teaching other people what they're learning. Okay, and then they take ownership, which is really responsibility. All right? They don't just point the finger and say, y'all ought to do this. They actually help make it happen. I think that applies here as well. Leaders, particularly elders, this is probably one of the biggest things. Need in this church, because we're committed to the house, we need elders. For elders, one of the most important things is, can you actually gather, lead, and shepherd a cluster? Now, it doesn't mean you have to be an elder in order to gather, lead, or shepherd a cluster. But somebody who is going to be an elder better be able to do that, because that is the bread and butter of what we do as a church. Okay, over the next 2 years, our biggest challenges, number one, can we figure out the clusters thing? Number two, how do we develop elders? And right now, clusters is the first thing, but the elders is at least 2 years out. Okay? So, with that, I'm going to say this. How do you be a member? Well, first of all, let me just remind you where we started. The core thing, you have to be a Christian. You have to buy into the Apostles' Creed and the vows. I included that in your handout again. You have to be baptized. But practically, you can go through membership. You express your intent. You meet with leaders for an informal interview. And what we're looking for is not that you get everything or agree on everything. Jen, you mentioned, did we go through when you did membership and be like, hey, all those things that you struggle with, you got to get on board with an official position? No, we didn't. You can actually disagree with a lot of stuff and still, the question is, do you see yourself as an Apostles' Creed kind of Christian? And can you actually make the vows? All right? Do you really believe in God? Do you believe Jesus is a Savior? Do you believe you're a sinner? Do you want to try to follow Him? Do you think that you need a community? Those kinds of things. If you can do that, you can have tons of other questions and doubts and be in process. We're not looking for perfect people. We're looking for honest, authentic people who are trying to follow Jesus. Okay? So practically, faith, commitment, but here's some rules of thumb. Are you attending? We generally suggest somebody who's going to become a member probably needs to have come for at least 6 months, just so you've got a real feel for the church. But we'd like to see members be here at least 75% of the time. Doesn't mean you can't be a member, but that's like a good rule of thumb. We want you to be involved. Okay? We want you to really resonate with the values and call that we talked about. If you disagree, we'd love to know where the places are that you disagree. In other words, can you talk about it and can you express charity towards other people? Baptism, have you been baptized? Kids can also be members, but they've got to have a believing parent. Okay, and they have to be baptized. One last thing. How do you de-member? Okay? I've been in some churches where like once you get in, the only way out is they like excommunicate you. And I'm like, that feels terrible. And number one, that is not in anybody's book of church order, by the way. So I've seen church, in other words, they've gone beyond their book. So here's the thing. The way we say it is, first of all, it's helpful to remember, assume everybody's going to leave in 3 to 5 years. Not everybody's going to, but assume most people in a church are going to move on in 3 to 5 years. So when somebody leaves, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay? In fact, it could be a really good thing. It usually is. Okay, the second thing is, if you decide you want to move on, maybe you're just moving away, just tell us. Okay? Emily McCauley moved away. Technically, she's still a member, but as she becomes a member of a new church out there, we'll pull her off the rolls here. Okay, what if you decide that you disagree on something? You can get out of your membership at any time. All you need to do is basically be as public as you were getting in. So if you get in, you're like, I want to be a member. When you want to get out, you say, I no longer want to be a member. And we encourage you to say, tell us why, and we want to give you an opportunity to share it with the church. In a small church like this, it is really, really important to share those reasons. In a big church, somebody leaves, you don't notice it. In a small church, somebody stops coming, you notice it. The best thing you can do is just talk about it. Okay? And we can affirm somebody who's honest all day long, even if we disagree on the position. When does somebody actually, well, let me say this. If somebody moves away and stops attending, after a year, we've got the right to take them off the roll. Let's say you just ghost us. Okay. After a year, we might take you off. We might not. If somebody says, hey, there's extenuating circumstances, still want to stay a member. Where would somebody get excommunicated? Kicked out. I've never actually seen this happen in any church I've been in that I've pastored, by the way. So super rare. Here would be the only place. In other words, if somebody wants out, we just let them out. Excommunication would happen where somebody doesn't want out, but they're doing something that the leadership of the church feels is like so blatant or so egregious that it really is not, it's casting a bad light on Jesus and on the church. Let me give you an example. We had a gal who was in this church once who loved this church. None of you know her, except for Jordan probably. But her husband was probably cheating on her. And so she started to get involved with another guy. In other words, she justified her own. And she's like, I am going to pursue this relation. And we're like, hey, this is not the way to do this. And she's like, I'm going to pursue it. I'd like to be a member of the church too. And we're like, no, you can't. Do you see how that's incongruous? So she didn't, but if she had been a member of the church, that would have been a place. Now, here's what you do. You don't just kick them out. You start talking. There's a lot of talking. But my point is, excommunication, in my experience, is actually incredibly rare, or it should be. Because mostly what you're doing is you're starting to have a conversation, and you're calling people to align with their vows. And if you don't align, to be honest and go like, oh, if we're actually moving different directions, let's just call it what it is, tell everybody, and we can all move on and still be friends. Okay, last thing, I want to remind you what matters most. Jesus. Okay, we're talking about all these particulars. It is easy to be critical and think some of these things are stupid. Some of them probably are. Okay, or to be proud. These are the best things ever. I love being EPC. You know, we're the few, the proud, the very few. Okay. I love committees. No. Exactly. Robert's Rules of Order. If you go to seminary, you got to learn Robert's Rules of Order. Okay. It's easy to be critical, it's easy to be proud, or it's easy to be a consumer, which is like, I want a church that thinks this way, votes this way, believes in these things. I actually think it's really helpful to remember that what we really want is truth, and we want Jesus. Grace and truth. The problem with every church, it's not denominations, it's not theology, it's not their positions, it's people. We're sinners. Okay? Paul says in 1 Timothy 1:15, here is a trustworthy saying deserving of full acceptance. Christ Jesus came into the world to rescue sinners, of whom I am chief. He was merciful to me as foremost of sinners, that he might demonstrate his perfect patience for others. If we actually had churches full of people that really saw themselves as big sinners, can you imagine how gracious and compassionate it would make us towards people we disagree with? Because we'd actually look at them and go, they might be wrong, and Jesus could still die for them and cover them. So you know what? We're in this together. We're family. So I just want to come back to what we need most. It's not purity. We actually need Jesus. We need to know him. We need to love him. We need to love one another. All right? Whirlwind. We'll talk about it over lunch. Let me pray for us.